For our next story today, let's talk about beer. You could say it's one of the oldest bedrocks of human civilization, brewed all over the world. It has quenched the thirsts of virtually all classes of society for longer than recorded history. But now beer is causing many to bubble over with anger thanks to the President of France, Emmanuel Macron. A video of his has gone viral. He's seen downing a bottle of beer in 17 seconds in a rugby club dressing room. People are seen cheering for him as he chugs the beer. But many others are also angry. This has prompted a political row with a hint of déjà brew, pardon the pun. What am I talking about? Our next report tells you.
No, this isn't a frat boy chugging beer at a college party. This is the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, downing a bottle of beer in just 17 seconds. He's doing so in a rugby club dressing room with players and coaching staff cheering him on. What's the occasion? Toulouse beat La Rochelle to win the French top 14 rugby title. So, amid the celebrations, Macron was handed a beer bottle and urged to down the drink in one go. And that's exactly what the president did. Then slammed the empty bottle on the counter, pleased as punch. But little did he know about the trouble that he would soon be in. Macron is now facing a terrible hangover after draining the bottle, but not the kind you'd expect. His beer chugging footage has gone viral and is brewing a political storm. If you look closely, Macron is drinking a beer which was the favorite drink of late right-wing President Jacques Chirac. So Macron is also being accused of making overtures to the right. But not just that, he's also been accused of toxic masculinity. This is what Sandrine Rousseau, MP for the left-wing Green Party, tweeted. Toxic masculinity in political leadership in one image. While some are angry, others are simply disappointed. Why? The president has a responsibility of being a role model. A beer-chugging hero is not what France is looking for. With one seemingly innocuous action, Macron linked sports, parties and alcohol consumption, which was served with an unhealthy dose of peer pressure. Because even if you're the president, when urged, you will drink a bit too much. Now, some of these are assumptions, others are allegations stemming from disappointment. But one fact above all has been quite surprising for many: Macron's sudden love for beer. The president is a staunch supporter of the French wine industry. He claimed to regularly drink wine. He also previously blocked attempts to promote Dry January, which sees people starting the year alcohol-free. Macron in the past has said that beer is bad, but drinking wine, not so much. So why did Macron down the wrong drink? That too amid cheers in a room full of men. Some say this could be on purpose. During his early years, Macron was a popular leader. But over time, his image has taken a hit, especially as he tried to push a law to change the retirement age in France. This sparked mass protests across the country. In March, he was filmed having a beer in Kinshasa, the capital of DRC, amid French pensions crisis. He was accused of being cut off from ordinary concerns back home. So many wonder if Macron is again using beer to reframe his image. Is this sudden love for beer a public stunt or political stratagem to show that he's a man of the people? But did it backfire? Because now the increasingly unpopular French president is being accused of toxic masculinity. As many would know, binge drinking rarely comes with good consequences. And it looks like Macron's hangover is here to stay.
So 25 years ago, India was under US sanctions. Today, Washington is New Delhi's largest trading partner. It sounds like a drastic turn of events, but it's not really an unexpected one. You see, India-US ties are growing rapidly. At the heart of this is the economic partnership and trade. And Prime Minister Modi's visit comes at a crucial time. As I mentioned, the US is India's largest trading partner. bilateral trade rose to $191 billion. Compare that to 2021, it was around $80 billion. In fact, India-US trade has surged by nearly 800% between 1999 and 2019. Imagine that, 800% rise. It just shows how far things have come between the two countries. And make no mistake, this is a strategic relationship. Both countries have their own agenda. They want to reduce their dependence on China. That's one of the reasons why they're together. And this cooperation becomes crucial. It's being driven by groupings like the Quad and the I2U2. The Quad has India, the US, Australia, and Japan, 4 members. I2U2 has India, Israel, that's I2, and the US and UAE, that's U2. Now, these are crucial forums for joint investments and new initiatives. Plus, there are other bilateral investments, a mammoth Boeing aircraft deal, defense deals, the crucial chip partnership. You see, chips are key to power in the 21st century. So India is pushing itself as an alternative to China. New Delhi wants to boost semiconductor manufacturing. And this is a plan that the US supports. It wants to help India. It wants to expand cooperation in emerging technologies like supercomputing and, of course, semiconductors. The idea is quite simple. Build a resilient global supply chain and reduce dependence on China. It's an ambitious goal, but one that could define our partnership. So to sum it up, bilateral trade is at a record high, investments and deals are pouring in, and we are staring at a tech partnership. It sounds almost perfect. But there are still a few issues. Even with all this, India-US trade ties are not where they should be. There is still some friction there. The US does not like India's protectionist policies, especially in terms of foreign investment. On the other hand, India says that the US is not accommodating enough. It doesn't really consider the fact that India is still a developing country. So there are differences. What is the solution? One could be the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or the IPEF. The US could ask India to join the trade pillar. Now let me give you some background. The IPEF was launched by the Americans in May last year. And it has 4 pillars: trade, supply chains, clean economy, and fair economy. Now, India has joined 3 pillars, but it hasn't joined the 4th one, that is trade. So Washington may want India to join it. Which brings us to the free trade agreement. There was a lot of buzz around this, but it has now fizzled out, it seems. Both India and the US have ruled out any trade deals, so an FTA may not be on the table. The other issue is trade disputes at the WTO. That's the World Trade Organization. Reports suggest that India and the US are looking at an out-of-court settlement. What does that mean? Well, the WTO is a global trade body. Currently, India and the US have 7 trade disputes there. Now, reports say they want to settle these disputes outside the court, which could mean a voluntary withdrawal of some of these cases, some or all of them. And Prime Minister Modi's visit could see a breakthrough there. Both India and the US want to reach a $500 billion mark in trade. It's a bold goal, but it's not impossible. The potential is limitless. What we need is bolder economic agendas, one that is focused on trade and technology. If India and the US want to emerge as a force, as a bulwark against China, they must strengthen their economic relationship, iron out the outstanding issues, and focus on the positives. Over in China, there is a big problem. Their economy is stalled. It was speeding on the highway for most of the last decades, but now the engine has broken down. So what is Beijing doing? Well, today their central bank decided to cut 2 interest rates for the 1-year loan and for the 5-year loan. Now, China is hoping that this will kickstart their economy. How does that work? Time for a quick lesson. We know that banks charge interest on loans, but who fixes that interest? Who decides how much a bank will charge? That's the central bank of the country. If they cut interest rates, then loans become cheaper, meaning people can borrow and spend more, which is good for the economy. If they hike interest rates, if the central bank hikes interest rates, loans become more expensive. So there is less borrowing, and consequently there is less spending, which is bad for the economy. Now, China is trying the first strategy. They're cutting interest rates to boost loans and spending. By how much? 10 basis points. This is the first interest cut by China in 10 months. The last one was after the disastrous zero-COVID lockdowns. Now, it's an interesting situation. In the Western world, central banks are hiking interest rates because their biggest problem is inflation. But China's problem is the opposite. The economy is so bad that people are not spending any money. Prices are not going up. They're bottoming out. Will the rate cut solve that issue? The markets are not too confident. Both Hong Kong and Shanghai indices were trading in the red. It seems investors wanted a bigger rate cut. Plus, rate cuts are not really a quick fix. In China, they take a long time to trickle down. Take the big companies. They negotiate all their loans in one go over a few weeks. So the new interest may not apply to them. Same with home buyers. The mortgages are tweaked in the month of January. Right now, we're in the month of June. So don't expect radical changes. Let's also look at the larger picture. What's happening to China's economy? I'll show you three indicators. Three indicators that should sum things up. First is industrial production. Industrial production increased by 5.6% in the month of April. But the very next month, in the month of May, it was down to 3.5%, which means the momentum has disappeared. The second indicator is exports. What China sells to the rest of the world. What do they export? That fell to 7.5% in the month of May. Experts had predicted a 0.4% decline. The actual fall was 7.5%. Tells you how bad the situation is. Finally, the third indicator, and that is jobs. China's youth unemployment is at a record high. It was more than 20% in the month of May. So if you take 5 Chinese youth in the age of 16 to 24, one of them doesn't have a job. Put all these indicators together, and what do you get? A slowdown. Goldman Sachs has cut the GDP forecast for China. Their first estimate was 6%. Their new one is 5.4%. Remember, this is China we're talking about. They were growing double digits in the first decade of the century. So what happened to them? Well, experts blame multiple reasons for the slowdown. For example, the type of growth, the growth model that the Chinese followed, build, build, and build. That strategy works in the short term, but in the long term, you need innovation, you need reform. Both have eluded China. They're left with ghost buildings and highways to nowhere. Another reason is Xi Jinping's policies. A big part of China's booming growth was foreign investment. Multinational companies built facilities in China. They put money in China. It was called the factory of the world. But President Xi Jinping has scared these corporates away. He's cracked down on everything, has spooked multinationals. Many MNCs are leaving. Seems like Xi has realized this finally. He met with 2 titans of the corporate world recently, Elon Musk and Bill Gates. It could be an attempt to satisfy foreign investors. But my point is, this is going to be a massive challenge after what you've been doing so far. If this is just a phase of slowdown, China may escape. Perhaps things will get better in the second half of the year. But if it's a structural problem, it will be much more difficult to handle. We'll have to wait and see how this plays out. And finally, some sobering news. The Himalayan glaciers are dying. They may lose 75% of their ice by the end of this century. Let me repeat that. 3/4 of the Himalayan glacier could melt by the end of 2100. And this will put about 2 billion people at risk. That's a quarter of humanity. These are the findings of a new report. Here's more.
The Himalayas, the tallest mountain range in the world. They connect to a lot of other ranges, like the Hindu Kush, Karakoram, and Pamirs. Together, these linking ranges are the roof of the world. This great range is sometimes referred to as the Hindu Kush Himalayas. These mountain ranges contain great peaks, like Mount Everest, K2, and Kanchenjunga. In fact, all of the world's top 100 peaks are part of these ranges. But that's not all. They also contain some of the world's greatest glaciers. And these glaciers feed some of the mightiest rivers: the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Indus, Mekong, Yangtze, and others. All of them are fed by the Hindu Kush Himalayas. And in turn, these rivers help feed and sustain billions. Around 2 billion people across Asia depend on these rivers. And all these people, making a quarter of the human race, are in danger. Because the life-giving glaciers of the Himalayas are melting at an unprecedented rate. The International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, or ICIMOD, in Nepal has released a report. It says that Hindu Kush Himalayan glaciers could lose 75% of their ice by the year 2100. And this is not something that can be fixed later.
Some of these changes, glacier melt, this decline in snow cover, these are irreversible. Once the glaciers are gone, it's gone.
Why is this happening? Global warming, of course. When measuring human-made climate change, we follow a base measure, the average global temperature before the Industrial Revolution. The world is currently set to get 3 degrees Celsius hotter than pre-industrial levels. This will be by 2100. Now, 3 degrees Celsius may not sound apocalyptic, but that's the global average temperature change. Some areas will heat up more than others, and fragile ecosystems like the Hindu Kush Himalayas will be worse affected. In fact, the effects of global warming are already showing. According to the ICIMOD, Himalayan glaciers melted 60% faster since 2010 than in the previous decade.
But looking at the data from satellites, we can see just from 2000 and 2009 and then to the following decade, there was a significant increase, over 60% increase in the glacier melt. And that's huge in just 10 years. And this is going to have really big consequences.
60% faster in just a decade. And the effects are visible to all who go there.
Before we used to melt the ice from the glacier for drinking water. We still drink water, but from that is already melted and collected in ponds.
These ponds he's talking about eventually become glacial lakes, and when they form quickly, they are unstable. This leads to them bursting and sending a destructive torrent of water downstream. One of the worst examples of this is from India. In 2013, a glacial lake burst and flooded the town of Kedarnath. Thousands were killed in the pilgrimage site. Disasters like that will become more common as the Himalayan glaciers rapidly melt. And that's until the glacial waters are around. Once they get depleted, the rivers will start drying up. Mighty rivers like the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Mekong and Yangtze will all start to dwindle. This will affect the lives and livelihoods of 2 billion people. 1/4 of the human race. It's a disaster of uncomparable magnitude just waiting to happen. Before it does, governments around the world need to wake up. They cannot take climate change lightly. They need to aggressively move towards sustainable climate goals. If not, they will be a reason for unparalleled human suffering in the years to come.
And now let's turn our attention to Jenin, a city in the northern West Bank, home to over 300,000 people, also a scene of human suffering. There's been regular violence between Israelis and Palestinians here, but yesterday it witnessed one of West Bank's fiercest clashes. Israeli forces stormed Jenin's refugee camp. They fired live ammunition, stun grenades, and toxic gas. They used helicopter gunships for the first time in decades. 5 Palestinians were killed, many others were injured. What led to this attack? What is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's strategy, and how is the world reacting to these developments? Our next report tells you.
Heavy gunfire, a rain of explosive devices, smoke billowing from buildings, burning tires on the ground. These scenes are from Jenin, a violence-struck city in northern West Bank, which witnessed a large-scale clash yesterday, one of the West Bank's fiercest ever. What led to this clash? Before dawn, undercover Israeli troops entered Jenin's refugee camp, targeting the home of a Palestinian member of Hamas, which has been designated a terrorist organization by Israel. Following this, Palestinian terrorists targeted Israeli troop transport. Explosives were hurled at soldiers from multiple directions, so Israeli forces reacted. They fired live ammunition, stun grenades, and toxic gas. A combat helicopter was used to repel gunmen, in a first in 2 decades. Meanwhile, soldiers were extracted from troop transport. This resulted in one of the most intense West Bank firefights. It went on for hours. The result? 5 Palestinians, including a child, dead, over 90 civilians wounded, and 7 Israeli soldiers injured. What does the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have to say about it? He has applauded the efforts of his forces, saying that the soldiers were incredibly impressive. For Netanyahu, this attack was a message to terror forces, a crackdown on terrorism. Listen in.
We strike terrorism with might and determination. Over the past few months, we have assassinated and detained a record number of terrorists. This was the case also yesterday during an operation in Jenin. Our forces eliminated several terrorists, arrested others.
But many don't see it that way, especially as tensions have been on the rise in the West Bank. And Netanyahu's government is the most right-wing in Israeli history, so many have condemned Israel's actions. Listen in to what the UN has to say.
The Secretary General shares the views of his special coordinator toward Venezuela, who said just over the past hour that he was deeply concerned by today's events in Jenin, following an Israeli security forces operation and the ensuing exchange of fire, which resulted in 5 Palestinians killed, including a child, and some 60 Palestinians and 7 Israeli forces wounded, at the very least. I believe those numbers are going up as we speak. Such escalations threaten to plunge the region deeper into a deadly crisis. Mr. Venezuelan said that all sides must refrain from actions that would further escalate the situation and take steps to re-engage on a political path.
Iran and neighboring Jordan have also condemned the raid on Jenin. Jordan warned of an ongoing cycle of violence and stressed the need to halt Israel's continuous incursions into Palestinian cities. Meanwhile, Iran said Israel's criminal attacks are intensifying, calling it a clear example of organized crime and state terrorism. Hamas too has condemned the Jenin raid and praised the resistance. No shocker there. But listen in.
The Zionist occupation carried out a crime in Jenin through the raid using tanks and planes and by killing martyrs in this Zionist occupation against the camp. It shows that the resistance still exists in all West Bank cities, and the threats by the occupation of a military operation will not stop the resistance in the West Bank.
So while Israel stands its ground, with big plans to crack down on terrorism, and Palestinian forces remain undeterred, Palestinians continue to bury their dead, with a devastating casualty toll on the rise.
Yesterday, we told you about the Indian diaspora in the US. Of course, Indians are by no means alone here. Over the centuries, a number of foreign communities have made their home in America, and one of those communities are the Chinese. Almost every major city in the US has what's known as a Chinatown. Chinese migrants would usually settle in these areas where they first came to the US. These Chinatowns were a way for Chinese immigrants to stay together, to keep their cultural identity alive. But over time, they have changed, sometimes because of internal factors, and at other times because of the shadowy influence of Beijing. Our next ground report is from the Chinatown in Washington, D.C. This is Washington's Chinatown. A massive friendship arch draws you in. It's about 60 feet high, with colorful dragons on the top. The streets here are very different from the rest of Washington. They look distinct. The shop fronts are more colorful. They display texts in both English and Mandarin. There's graffiti on the walls. Chinatowns in the US have existed for almost 200 years. They started popping up in the mid-1800s. The first one was built in San Francisco. The city was an unofficial entry port at the time. Thousands of Chinese citizens were leaving home. Poverty, hunger, and harsh economic conditions were forcing them out. And San Francisco gave them a new life. They found work here, in railroad construction and mining, among other fields. Soon, Chinese immigrants fanned out across the US, and Chinatowns mushroomed all over the country. The Chinese did this with little or no help from local governments. They acquired buildings. They developed business links on their own. It led to a boom in Chinatowns. The US has 50 states. At one point, it also had 50 Chinatowns. On the face of it, they may seem like just cultural hubs, a home away from home for immigrants, a safe haven, a place of comfort and security. Soon, this American model of Chinatowns was replicated across the world. Today, there are more than 100 of them in Johannesburg, in Cuba's Havana, even in Myanmar. As the network of Chinatowns grew, the Chinese community gained influence. There are more than 10 million Chinese living overseas. This makes them an important voting bloc and an influential voice. The Communist Party sees that too. They want to tap into this influence. So Beijing decided to keep an eye on Chinatowns. It started secret police stations in these overseas settlements. One was recently busted in New York. In April, the local police arrested 2 men. Turns out they operated this secret police station. It was inside Manhattan's Chinatown, inside an office building. In at least one case, this outpost helped Beijing locate a pro-democracy activist. Going by recent statements, such secret police stations exist in more than 50 countries. And in many instances, Chinese spies have set up shop in local Chinatowns. Chinatowns were supposed to be symbols of cultural unity, but they're increasingly losing their identity. The shock of the pandemic and the rapid changes in urban spaces have forced many of the original inhabitants out. Also, China's increasing efforts at meddling in the affairs of others have put these settlements at risk. Chinatowns now run the risk of becoming pawns in a larger geopolitical game. Now, as you know, we are in Washington, D.C. It's the capital of the United States of America. It's a country that calls itself the world's oldest democracy. But the seat of power in this democracy has a dark past. Washington, D.C., like a lot of other American cities, was built on blood, sweat, and tears. Not just of the American revolutionaries, but also of slaves. Yes, the capital of the US, a country that styles itself as the leader of the free world, was built on the backs of the enslaved. Our next ground report looks at Washington's troubling trysts with slavery. If you take a stroll around Washington, D.C., you'll see how the past and the present converge. How old and historic sites stand next to modern structures. Some of these buildings are stories written in stone. This is the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, dedicated to the civil rights activist. He's the first African American to have a memorial in his name in this part of the capital. This is prime real estate. It's reserved for former presidents and war heroes. Martin Luther King Jr. is the first activist to be featured here. If you explore the neighborhood, you'll see that he has august company. But this city has a difficult and painful past. Many of these landmarks were built by slaves. Like the White House, it has a long history of employing slaves. The tales of the slaves at the White House are narrated here. This is a historical record of payments made by the White House to slave owners. They did not just build the presidential housing, they also served at least 10 presidents while they lived there. A former First Lady spoke about this.
I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. And I watch my daughters, 2 beautiful, intelligent black young women, playing with their dogs on the White House lawn.
The White House isn't the only landmark built by slaves. Nearby is the Washington Monument. It's a hallmark of DC's skyline. It's an imposing presence. It's supposed to showcase strength. It was built to honor America's first president, George Washington. This monument, too, was built by slaves. In fact, this tale was part of a Spider-Man movie, too. In Spider-Man Homecoming, Michelle, one of the lead characters, refuses to enter the Washington Monument. The reason? She did not want to go into a building built by slaves. Washington's skyline has another such story. this statue on top of the US Capitol. Americans call it the Statue of Freedom. Ironically, it was built by a slave. His name was Philip Reed. Reed was paid $1.25 a day to cast this 19-foot bronze statue. It features a woman holding a sword and a laurel wreath. As Martin Luther King once said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Eventually, the slaves of Washington did get justice. And this is their legacy, a city that champions freedom, built on the foundations of their suffering. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. A submarine that went to explore the Titanic wreckage has gone missing. A British billionaire is one of the tourists on board. The US and Canada have launched a search operation. In the US, Kilauea, the second largest volcano in Hawaii, is erupting again. And a massive fire broke out in Germany's largest amusement park. And finally, what makes the 20th of June significant? We're taking you back in history. On this day in 2001, General Pervez Musharraf declared himself as Pakistan's president. He replaced the country's president, Rafiq Tarar. This happened 2 years after Musharraf seized power for Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif in a military coup. We're leaving you with that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow from here, Washington, D.C.
And oneness of Allah, that there can be no prophet, there can be no prophet.
Eben noch nicht mehr gelassen, wenn wir eigentlich mit. Oh, sie leck mich aber was.